we're just a touch away. Monday to Friday at 12:30 p.m. only on Bloomberg Quint.
Welcome, you're watching Bloomberg Quint Live. Not many months ago, the former Chief Economic Advisor of India, Arvind Subramaniam, told me in Delhi at his book launch that he expects every political party to include some form of a universal basic income in its manifesto for the general elections. The Congress was first off the block today when party President Rahul Gandhi announced that if, quoted, voted to power in 2019, the Congress is committed to a minimum income guarantee for every poor person to help eradicate poverty and hunger, end of quote. This evening, I have none other than senior Congress party leader and former Finance Minister P Chidambaram with me to discuss what exactly is on offer with that minimum income guarantee scheme. Well, Mr. Chidambaram, thank you very much for joining us here on Bloomberg Quint. The Congress party president has been promising loan waivers in every state that he speaks in or the population of which that he addresses. That is, as all admit, a temporary solution to the ongoing agricultural crisis that we're seeing, a palliative of sorts. But now, over and above that, the party seems to have proposed a minimum income guarantee scheme. Can you explain to us what the scope and scale of this scheme will be?
Loan waiver was state-specific and contextual. The states in which the Congress was elected in the recent elections have implemented or are implementing loan waiver. So that's done and dusted. Now what we're talking about is a nationwide scheme which is an adaptation of the UBI idea. It is not UBI. We did not say universal basic income. It's an adaptation of the principle behind the UBI. We're going to target the poorest of the poor in this country and progressively ensure that every family is brought up to a level of income which is a minimum income. Now that, I think, is an idea whose time has come, and we can implement it if we form the next government.
Mr. Chidambaram, is it different from a universal basic income only in that it is not universal, that it is only targeted towards the poorer households of India? Is that the key distinction that you would draw?
That is the key distinction, but it has other distinctions as well. Under UBI, the same amount of money is given to anyone, to everyone, including you and me. Now, this is progressive. Once you agree upon a minimum level of income which a family must have, depending upon the distance of the family's current income from the desired income, that gap will be covered under the scheme. Some families may be 10% below the minimum level. Some may be 30% below the minimum level. Some may be 70% below the minimum level. So the amount that will reach each family will obviously be different. Everybody will be brought up to a minimum level.
And sir, can you explain to me what that minimum level is? So if you could just talk us through what the broad parameters, at least, of this minimum income guarantee scheme are. What is the universe of beneficiaries,
we can't
the transfer of the income amount, and the total cost effectively to the exchequer?
You are asking me to do the math now.
Yes.
As I said, we will flesh out the details in the manifesto. We'll have to wait for the Congress Party's manifesto.
Mr. Chidambaram, you've always been very fastidious about details as finance minister, so I'm sure you're not surprised that I'm asking you for the numbers, because the scope, the scale of this scheme, the affordability for the exchequer, and the implementability will also depend on really how you define the universe of the scheme. And therefore, I'm asking whatever you can share with us at this stage to make this scheme less a political promise and more an economic promise would be more than welcome.
All I can assure you is it is doable. The first question you should ask yourself is, should this be done? Anyone with a conscience, anyone with a heart will say, yes, this should be done. Look at the Oxfam report. If the Oxfam report does not move your conscience, nothing else will. So we have to bring everyone to the minimum level.
But the
second is, the poor have the first right, the first charge on the resources of this country. So we have resources. We have a GDP which is about 187 lakh crore or so. We have an annual expenditure this year of 18 lakh crore. It will grow. Therefore, the first charge on the total resources of this country must be to ensure that the poor are brought up to a level where they're no longer below a level of poverty, below poverty line. So once our priorities are rearranged so that this becomes a matter of high priority, we will find the resources. We will do the math when we are in government, because all the information will be available only within the government. And only today I read that government will announce the new poverty numbers in June 2019. And that will show a very sharp decline in the earlier estimates of poverty. So that's a starting point. So once we have the numbers, once we are in government and we assess the resources and the source of resources, we will tell you exactly how to implement it.
Mr. Chidambaram, nobody in their right mind can argue that, the poor don't have the first charge on any resources that this country has. But why has this realization come now? Your party had, 2 successive terms not very long ago, and at that point in time, a universal basic income, a quasi-UBI, or a minimum income guarantee was not necessarily a proposal on the table. So what has prompted the timing of this offer? Is it simply not just electoral politics?
So why don't you ask the question, why was it not implemented 50 years ago? Why was it not implemented 40 years ago? I mean, these are irrelevant questions. In the 10 years that we were in power, we lifted 140 million people out of poverty. And that's accepted by every agency, every body, every think tank, every economist. 14 crore people were lifted out of poverty by a variety of measures. Maganrega was a measure. When Maganrega was announced, there were fierce critics. But today, the fierce critic has become the most ardent champion of Maganrega. We introduced Adhered and DBT. The critics said, we come to power, we'll abolish it. The critics have now not only embraced it, but exceeded the authority given by law. So every idea, every novel idea, will have its share of opponents and critics. We can't be daunted by such criticism. If we are satisfied, as we are satisfied today, that this is an idea whose time has come, no family should be left behind. Remember, President Obama said, no child should be left behind. No family should be left behind. And I'm not sure of an earlier statement of yours. We find resources to fund a bullet train costing 1 lakh crore of rupees. We find funds to send a mission to the moon and to the Mars. I'm not questioning the correctness or otherwise of those ideas at this moment in this discussion with you. If we can find funds for those schemes, we can and we must find funds for what I'm proposing today, what the Congress President proposed early today. We can do it.
Sir, you misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting you don't get any credit for what you did in the previous 2 terms. I think the question I'm trying to pose to you, sir, is this. Is there something specific about a minimum income guarantee scheme or a UBI or a quasi-UBI that works better now than it would have worked 5 years ago or 7 years ago? So I'm asking you a very economic question. It's not a political on the defensive question. That's one. Secondly, I have no doubt that we do have resources as a nation to put to them. What I'm trying to understand is, what is the trade-off in those resources? So, for instance, will this minimum income guarantee scheme or proposal subsume a certain amount that's currently targeted towards subsidies? Will it subsume or, replace a certain amount that goes towards either agricultural subsidies or any other kind of rural subsidies? Those are the questions I'm putting to you.
That doesn't follow. That doesn't follow. Take, for example, ICDS. It's a scheme intended to achieve certain objectives. As long as those objectives are valid and good, that scheme will continue. But some schemes will outlive their utility. Therefore, those are decisions, those are conclusions that have to be drawn at any given point of time. So we'll ask ourselves in May, June, which are the schemes that have outlived their utility, which are the schemes that continue to deliver outcomes which we wanted. Those schemes will continue. But irrespective of that, irrespective of the current schemes and how many of them will continue or not, we will find the resources for the minimum income per family scheme, a minimum guaranteed income for every family to bring that family to a minimum level of income.
Mr. Chidambaram, you're not making a commitment one way or the other on whether this will subsume certain subsidy schemes. You said if if those schemes have reached a natural end of their life or end of their utility, then you will no longer prolong them. But it isn't as...
Why should I make a commitment now? Why should I make a commitment now? As I said, if a scheme is intended to serve certain objectives and those objectives are still valid, certainly the scheme will continue. And I gave you an example. ICDS will continue. Midday meal scheme will continue. And I can give you many more examples. But we are not discussing that today. We are discussing the merits of the scheme announced by the Congress President earlier today and whether we can find the resources for that scheme. And I assure you, we can and we will find the resources.
No, I understand we're discussing the merits, sir, but how do we discuss the merits without knowing who or specifically what universe of people this is targeted at? So even if you can, for instance...
You're welcome to discuss the merits. You're welcome to discuss the merits in the month of May and June.
But this is in a sense a proposal that has been proclaimed today. So I would imagine that, the party has thought through what it is that they're putting on offer. Therefore,
We have,
yeah,
and as I said in a tweet, we'll flesh out the details in our manifesto, so wait for our manifesto, and we'll also then flesh out the administrative measures and steps that have to be taken when we are in government.
So, okay, let me put it this way, sir. There are a variety of different estimates that have been put to quasi-UBI schemes of this nature. For instance, as you know, the former CA in a column that was published along with some colleagues today in the Business Standard suggested that, a partial or a quasi-UBI of about 1,500 rupees per month or 18,000 per annum per household would cost about 2.64 lakh crores. This is to cover 75% of all rural households. There is an estimate in the 2016-17 economic survey that suggests a UBI scheme that could cost up to about 5% of the GDP. Where, is the cost of what you all have envisaged somewhere in between of this 2.64% or 1.3% of GDP all the way up to 3 or 4% of GDP?
Dr. Arvind Subramaniam has done calculations to show that a modified scheme, I don't know what he calls it, will cost no more than 1.5% of GDP. We can do the math, we will do the math. Having announced it, are you suggesting that we are not capable of doing the math? We will do it. Question today is this a good idea? Is this an idea that will be welcomed and accepted by the people of India? Is this something which everyone, poor, middle class, rich, will support? Because we cannot have amidst us a section of the people who are utterly, abjectly poor. I think everyone will support the scheme and we will find the resources to fund the scheme and we'll tell you how to do it. We will tell you how we will do it. Many of the ideas will be, many of the aspects will be explained in the manifesto, and when we are in government, we will naturally roll out a fully detailed plan.
Mr. Chidambaram, you'll forgive me for
persisting. We did it with the loan waiver. When we announced loan waiver, there were fierce critics, but we did it and we rolled it out by the end of June of 2008, and about 60,000 crore of loans were waived for farmers. And I'm sure, I'm not saying you, but I'm sure many people at that time, I can't recall their names, said this is not doable. But we did it. Therefore, I'm confident we will do it, we can do it. In fact, we must do it. You must support us and help us do this.
Mr. Chidambaram, you'll forgive me for persisting, but I'll still ask you some more questions on the specifics, if at all you can share. So you said there were a couple of schemes that might fall off as a result of the introduction of a minimum income guarantee plan if you were to come to power or your party were to...
Can I interrupt you? Can I interrupt you? Can I interrupt you?
Yes, sure, sir.
You can go on asking me questions, but I'm not going to do the math sitting in front of a camera
I'm not asking.
with you at the other end in your studio. I'm not going to do the math like that. I will do the math with the people in the Economic Affairs Division, the Revenue Department, the economists, the Chief Economic Advisor, the Economic Advisory Council. We'll sit across the table, sit around the table, and we'll do the math. And then you can criticize the math to your heart's content.
I'm not here to criticize the math. I'm just trying to understand the effectiveness of this scheme and the effectiveness, therefore, of the proposal that the Congress party has made. You know, for instance, will it replace the fertilizer subsidy? Fairly entrenched subsidy, one might say, that India has, you know, and you would agree as well, as you've said in many of your previous interviews, that often many of our subsidy structures have been very distortive. Fertilizer is one of them, MSP has been another. So would you expect that distortive subsidies of this nature would actually fall off?
See, you know as well as I do, there are merit subsidies, there are demerit subsidies. Merit subsidies will obviously continue. There are demerit subsidies, they'll have to be revisited. But I'm not going into each subsidy. I gave you one example, I can give you a couple of more examples.
Please do.
The midday meal is a subsidized program. As I said, it will continue. It's intended to achieve a certain objective, that a child is not hungry in the middle of the day. A child need not go home to get a meal. The meal will be provided in the school. Now, a midday meal scheme might appear to be an anti-poverty program. But please remember, the richest countries provide a school lunch. So the midday meal is not a mere anti-poverty program. It has got other benefits. It's got other externalities, as the economists call it. Therefore, each scheme designed to achieve certain objectives, as long as objectives are good and valid, they will be continued.
So you said you'd give me a few more examples of schemes that might fall off?
I've given you more than I've given any other interviewer today.
Okay. Do you envisage this being an extension of the cooperative federalism that Dr. Subramaniam has spoken about very eloquently in his book, where he said that if India were to be able to take that cooperative federalism that enabled the implementation of GST, you know, however much we criticize the implementation process, the same cooperative federalism can help fix some of the endemic issues of agriculture, of land, of labor. So do you see this as a center and state combined initiative, or do you see the center funding most of it? Because there are challenges there as well if the state has to play an important part in the implementation of this.
See, the UPA and the Congress have always emphasized that the center and states must join together in implementing any national program. When we implemented midday meal scheme, it was a joint effort of both the center and the states. This obviously will be a joint effort of the center and the states, and I cannot believe any chief minister, any state will oppose the idea. This is so fundamental to our sense of nationhood that everyone in our country has a minimum level of income. It's so fundamental to that idea and hope that no state, no chief minister will oppose it. They will come on board. But the bulk of the responsibility will rest on the center. I don't regard this as a burden. I think this is a national obligation. The vast part of the responsibility will fall on the shoulders of the central government, and the states will bear the remaining part of the responsibility.
But you envisage this being both co-funded in some fashion by the states as well as, of course, more importantly, co-implemented?
We'll talk about it with the chief ministers. We will ask them how they will share the responsibility, and we will arrive at a consensus.
And let's say, for instance, you are confronted with a state that has an administration that is not necessarily, willing to help you in this program.
Are you talking for such a heartless administration?
I'm not going to just judge the administration, but I'm simply saying if you have an uncooperative administration,
I'm judging it. If any state opposes the idea that the poorest of the poor should be lifted to a minimum level of income, I would call that state heartless.
On the economics of it, sir, I have one quick question, and which is that, do you believe that we have within the budget pegged to a certain level of fiscal deficit the resources to be able to fund a program of this nature, or do you believe that this could have, albeit a temporary, but an effect nonetheless on the fiscal deficit? So are you pegging this to, let's say, a 3.1, 3.2, 3.3% fiscal deficit level of any sort?
These questions should be put to a government which has consistently slipped on its fiscal deficit target. I have adhered to the fiscal deficit target when UPA was in power. I am committing the Congress party to the path of fiscal prudence, fiscal discipline. We will adhere to the FRBM targets. In a growing economy, given the size of our GDP, given the stage of our development, given the size of our annual expenditure, I think it's possible to do it today. 30, 40 years ago, it would not have been possible. The GDP and the revenues of the government would not have permitted a scheme of this kind. But today, we are satisfied that given the size of our GDP and the scale of our expenditure, it's possible to implement a scheme of this kind. As I said, progressively. We will start with the poorest of the poor and go up to cover all the poor and bring all the poor to a minimum level of income.
But you won't tell me, sir, what number of families that is or anything like that? Not at this stage.
No, we will.
Not at this stage as you...
We will in the month of June. We will in the month of May, June. You're welcome to that meeting.
All right. One final question then, sir. There are critics, a universal basic income scheme has also been criticized.
For which scheme does not have critics, tell me? Any idea there will be a critic?
I know, but
I'm not discounting criticism. I'm not in any way belittling criticism. All I'm saying is, if there is genuine criticism, valid criticism, we will take that into account and modulate the scheme. We will take those criticisms into account. In fact, I welcome criticism. Without criticism, how do we know that we are on the right track?
No, fair enough. I'm asking or speaking to you on a conceptual level as a last question. Some of the criticism that the UBI has faced, and this has been discussed in the economic survey as well, is whether it reduces the incentive to work, whether income should ever be detached from employment in any fashion, should income be unconditional in any fashion. That's broadly the kind of criticism that a UBI faces, which is a universal basic income. When it's not universal, for instance, Aksham Khosla wrote this fantastic paper for the Carnegie, which said that, if it's not universal, by discarding universal coverage, the survey leaves the door open for inefficient means testing. Targeting performance can vary quite widely, and any savings generated thus can be, offset by fairly high costs. So my question to you is, there are critics for both UBI and a quasi-UBI, which is not a universal basic income scheme. How do you analyze that criticism?
I don't have to answer those criticisms because we are not implementing UBI. We are adapting the principle behind UBI, and we have announced a minimum level of income for every family that is poor. I mean, how many times can I explain the difference between UBI and the minimum level of income for each family? They are chalk and cheese. We are not talking about UBI. We are talking about a very different scheme that adapts the principle, that draws the principle of UBI and applies it to our situation and our needs. Our situation and our needs is, there is still a significant number of families in this country who are very poor, who are below whatever poverty line you and I and others will agree upon. We are trying to bring everybody to that level of income so that nobody is so poor that he can't find food for his family, that he can't get clothes for his children to wear, that he can't have a roof over his head, that he can't buy basic medicines. So that is the kind of poverty we are targeting. We targeted poverty in the UPA earlier through other schemes, and we lifted 14 crore people out of poverty. Now we are going further, if I may say, the last mile in the war against poverty, and we are targeting the very poor and bringing everybody to a minimum level of income. This is very different from the UBI. Therefore, the math concerning UBI does not apply here. This math will be worked upon the level of poverty that is assessed in May, June 2019, at what distance each percent of that poor population is away from the minimum. Some may be 10% away, some may be 20% away, some may be 70% away, and there will be different amounts transferred to each family so that all of them come to a minimum level of income. So this is a sui generis scheme, and we have thought through it. We are satisfied that it can be done. We are convinced it must be done. We are convinced it must be done, and we will find a way to do it.
If your party does come to power, Mr. Chidambaram, will this be the first thing that you all will do?
There are many things which claim the right to be the first thing to be done.
Will it be?
How can you say that? How can you say that national security is less important, or
I'm suggesting from an economic agenda point of view, will it be at least something that you will do in the first year itself?
Of course. This is high priority, and this will be addressed with a sense of urgency it deserves. Equally, we must address the challenge of nutrition. We must address the challenge of educational deficiencies. You saw the ACER report. You saw the report on Human Development Index. Those are equally important challenges. If you are a reader of my column, you will know that I have written several columns on this nutritional deficiencies and educational deficiencies. They are as important.
All right.
National security is important. So everything will be addressed.
Well, I'm not denying that those are important as well. I was just trying to see if you were willing to commit to doing this first off the bat, if you were to return to power, that is, because that really is the politics of the day, isn't it? We've moved the nation's conversation towards a minimum income guarantee scheme. That's what you call it, some form of UBI. That's what I call it. The difference only is that it's not a fixed amount. It's a dynamic amount depending on how far away a household is from a poverty line. At this point, it's only a political proclamation, Mr. Chidambaram. We'll wait for the details to be able to argue the semantics with you to better understand the economics behind this proposal. But you clearly have stolen a march over the BJP government, and that is that you've put your proposal out there first. Now, in any ways, doing nothing but forcing them to follow yours. So if they were to announce anything, they will sound as if they're following in your footsteps and not leading the thought process on this.
We are not in a competition with the outgoing government. We reflect and we make announcements based upon our convictions, our philosophy, our commitment to eradicating poverty. Therefore, please don't pit us in a race with the outgoing government. Please take what we say and assess it on its own merits. And on calm reflection, everybody in this country will agree that this is an idea whose time has come, and as a nation we must rally together, find the resources and implement the scheme. In fact, I will welcome the critics first rather than the cheerleaders, because it is the critics who will tell us where we are going wrong, where we are likely to go wrong. So we will factor all that before we actually roll out the design of the scheme. In the manifesto, you will get the contours of the scheme. In government, when we announce the scheme, we will tell you exactly the specific details of the scheme.
All right, Mr. Chidambaram, appreciate you finding the time to speak with us today. We will be waiting eagerly for the details in the manifesto to better understand the scope and scale of what is so far only a political promise, and that is of a minimum income guarantee. That's the former Finance Minister and Senior Congress Party leader P Chidambaram in conversation with Bloomberg Queen. Thanks very much for tuning in.